and you're all very welcome to this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are, event. I'm very happy to be chairing this panel discussion. My name is Suzanne Lynch. I'm a journalist with Politico Europe based in Brussels. I'm the co-author of Brussels Playbook, the morning newsletter, and delighted to be with you all today from a very grey Brussels, which won't surprise many of you. I was very lucky to be involved in this project back in the summer of the NextGen network run by the Aspen Institute. We met a group of younger people to discuss, to thrash out, to argue, to debate issues around and surrounding the transatlantic relationship. I think the aim of this very much is to ensure that the next generation's voice are being heard. And so this theme of intergenerationality is a big part of this project, but also the international dimension. I think we had participants from 14 countries in the workshops that happened during the summer in May and June. We looked at, it was interesting, we met at that point when we were about 5 or 6 months into the Biden administration. There was a lot of talk, and I think there is still a lot of soul searching and debate about what is the nature of the transatlantic relationship that for so long has been the fulcrum of Western democracy, of international relations, and, you know, has been under threat in various ways over the last few years. And that's not just from without, from places outside America and Europe, but also from within America and Europe. In the report that we're launching here today, you will see, if you've had the time to look through it, some of the different themes and recommendations we looked at. So they were things like sustainability, democracy, technology, and economic opportunity, and how these are in very much the fulcrum of the transatlantic relationship, but also how we need to kind of work on and develop them. Before we get into it proper, thank you very much to Microsoft for their support for this project. You will know that Secretary Madeleine Albright was scheduled to join us. She is unfortunately unable to, but she is delighted that her friend Federica Mogherini is going to speak to us today. And all our participants on the Next Generation format and workshops, we're delighted to have heard from Federica Mogherini during our meetings and our workshops back in the summer. So it's fantastic to have her back. Just to introduce, I mean, she will not need much introduction to everybody on this call. Federica Mogherini is Director of the College of Europe here in Belgium since September 2020. She served as the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, effectively the EU's top diplomat between 2014 and 2019. And prior to that, she was very well known and had held highly esteemed roles in Italian politics, including serving as Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation and a member of the Italian Chamber of Deputies. So thank you very much, Minister Mogherini, for being with us today. And I'm going to give the floor to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you all. Let me also, from my side, thank Microsoft for the support, but also Aspen Institute for this great program and initiative, and for this excellent report. I'm pleased and honored to be part of this launch today. And I have been delighted to join the same group of young leaders that are with us today during the course of last year for exchange that I remember vividly as a very stimulating one, also for myself, and not hopefully also for them, but for sure for myself. I thought that this initiative was a great one since the beginning, since when Madeleine talked about this to me, because, well, first of all, as you mentioned, Suzanne, transatlantic relation and partnership is the backbone of, has been the backbone of international balances and dynamics for a long time, and has been under strain for the last few years, and definitely since last year, since the change in administration. the entire reflection on how to relaunch it, on which kind of basis, on what basis, on which principles, on I would say how to reinvent and refresh this partnership in a productive way has been, I think, and is vital, not only for the two entities, not only for Europe and the United States, but also, for instance, for the Atlantic Alliance, for NATO, but also for the entire world in its complexity. If Europe and the United States do not find the right way to work together, to coordinate, to exchange point of views, to cooperate on certain files, there's very little hope for most of the crises and challenges we face in the world to be solved at short or long term. And here comes, I think, the fact that the younger generations have a responsibility and have a role to play. We always refer, and also here today, we refer to them as the next generation. I actually believe it's the generation that already today has a role to play, has a voice to be heard, as you mentioned, Susan, and has ideas that can be extremely helpful for the decision makers, for institutions, for public opinions to create or recreate a strong transatlantic bond. So I believe that getting these ideas out there, empowering young people to express themselves, to formulate proposals, and to be players in today's world and in today's transatlantic relationship is of vital interest, not just for themselves, not just for the younger leaders, but also for society as a whole and for our communities and ultimately for the entire world. So I believe that it is a next generation, but it is also the generation that already today has something to say and has something to teach us on many different things on which they have more knowledge and sometimes more wisdom than the previous generations have demonstrated to have. So I welcome this report very much, as I've welcomed very much this process. I'm looking forward to the panel that I believe will be extremely interesting with a different variety of points of view and backgrounds, as diverse as been the background of the young leaders that have participated to this program, and that I think has represented really the richness of this work. Again, I'll stop it here because I think the most interesting part is yet to come today, but it's with great pleasure today that I'm part of this, and a lot of gratitude to all the young leaders that have mobilized during this last months to make this happen, contributing with their own ideas, with their own passion, with their own energy to shape this reports, these proposals, these ideas that I'm sure will be extremely useful for the years to come. So thank you again, and looking forward to the debate today.
Thank you very much, Minister Mogherini, and thank you again for some of your thoughts you gave us, including the fact you talked, I remember, over the summer about how when you started in the European Commission, you were one of the youngest. And, you know, one of the themes that ran through and is running through our conversation is the need for more engagement, as you say, and the role that younger people can play in developing this transatlantic relationship. So I'm going to throw it open now to our panelists. So just some introductions first of all, and thank you very much for all being here. So we have on our panel today Adrian Shabazz. He's Director of Technology and Democracy for the Freedom House, and he heads the organization's research and policy on human rights in the digital age. He's a lead author for Freedom on the Net, which is an annual report on global internet freedom, as well as the founder of Election Watch for the Digital Age, a data-driven initiative tracking the risk of censorship, disinformation, and violence ahead of national elections. We have Beatriz Camacho. She is the Ecosystem Manager for the Regional Innovation Scheme in Southern Europe at the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. She is a Senior Project Manager. Before her career in issues around climate innovation, she was a political science professor and undertook her PhD research in political representation and social research techniques. She is currently based in Valencia and is a fellow at the Aspen Institute with the Next Generation Transatlantic Initiative. We are also joined by Casper, sorry, bear with me, Casper Klinge, who's Vice President of European Government Affairs for Microsoft. Casper also had a very long, illustrious career. He served as Denmark's tech ambassador in Silicon Valley, but is also ambassador of Denmark to Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and Cyprus. He has held various positions within the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as deputy head of NATO's multinational Helmand Provincial Reconstruction Team in Afghanistan. And earlier in his career, he also worked in Brussels with the General Secretariat of the Council of the Ministers of the EU. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Just bear with me here one moment, just technically. Just make sure I can see everyone. Thank you. Okay, so Adrian, maybe we'll start with yourself. You know, your work and your interest is in this whole area of democracy. We, during our discussions and for this report, when we were examining the importance of the transatlantic relationship, we also looked at some of the threats to that. And one of those was the rise of authoritarianism. And how Europe and the US can counter that. How much of a threat is that? What are your views on where things stand at the moment for this next generation when it comes to the transatlantic relationship and those issues of democracy?
Well, thank you, Suzanne. And thank you to Aspen and Microsoft for organizing and supporting this, and also to all of the NextGen fellows who I had the pleasure of just chatting with over a few times last year. So, you know, as you mentioned, Suzanne, one of the resounding takeaways from our discussions, and this is in our report, was the importance of shared values in the transatlantic relationship. The trouble is, and this was, you know, very apparent on all sides, is that these values are now in decline. Not only globally, you know, Freedom House has shown that there's been a 15 consecutive years of decline in political rights and civil liberties around the world. But we also discuss, you know, within the United States and Europe, how we've seen rising illiberalism, nativism, and isolationism that is leading to many different incidents. You know, we talked about racial justice issues in the United States, of course, the shocking events in January 6th. And also, you know, the deterioration of independent institutions in places like Hungary and Poland. So after we spoke, there's just been, you know, current events have not let up at all. And now we've seen numerous crises on Europe's eastern borders. You know, first you had Belarus, you know, the brutal dictator there, forcing a plane to land to kidnap an exiled activist and journalist, not to mention the repression against around the flawed election. And now, of course, the escalation of violence in Ukraine by the Russian government, to see what will happen there, you know, in the coming weeks. So it's apparent that while, you know, we talk about shared values and the importance of it, in practice, we're not seeing these values upheld, both by politicians which are elected in the US and the European Union, as well as around the world. And I think that the big thing that came out too was that the importance of that there's so much importance now on the transatlantic relationship, given the rise of China. I think that, you know, over the past couple of decades, China now plays a very important role in the international system. It is shaping norms around and promoting its norms around digital authoritarianism and non-interference in domestic affairs, which is having a very negative effect on prospects for democracy and human rights around the world. So, you know, just to set the stage, that our discussions were really, you know, a little bit pessimistic around whether these, you know, these kind of notions that we've held to be true around the shared values in the transatlantic relationship. But there's so much work that needs to be done right now in terms of making sure that both the US and the EU are defending these values within their own homes, and also playing a greater role internationally in pushing back against authoritarian influence, and also building up greater resilience against authoritarian intrusions.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, Casper. I mean, since we've been Adrian, but since we've been speaking, this issue of there's been question marks about the strength of the transatlantic relationship, particularly after the withdrawal from Afghanistan at the end of the summer, and then the tensions over the AUKUS defense deal and those tensions between France and America, for example. There's been a concern. I spent my first half of the year in America. I was living there, and I came back in the second half of last year to Brussels after an interlude. And there is a worry, I think, in Brussels about, since the Trump administration, there was a hope that this would be the great return to a deep relationship between America and Europe under Joe Biden. And it hasn't quite worked out that way. And I think what you mentioned there about China is a hugely important backdrop here in terms of issues around democracy, but also issues around climate change and sustainability, issues around technology. But how committed is America to the transatlantic relationship? That is a big question I think people are asking now. It came up in the last few weeks over the Russian-Ukraine crisis, when it became obvious that Moscow really just wants to deal with Washington and the European Union. I mean, whatever for NATO, but the European Union was not at a lot of the meetings where those decisions are being made. So it is a bit of a moment, I think, of reflection about where this transatlantic relationship is going. I mean, Casper, what's your views? I mean, are you positive about the state of the transatlantic relationship at the moment, or do you think there are challenges to it?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me, and congratulations to the Aspen Institute and also to the Next Generation for the report produced. I have to say it's sort of a little bit with mixed feelings that I'm invited to this, because I realize I'm the oldest one, both on the panel, and invited to comment on Next Generation reports means that I'm not part of the Next Generation. But we'll leave it at that. I think Adrian and to some extent you, Suzanne, you're pointing to the reality, and I think actually the report also shows that we've had a dip in sort of transatlantic feelings during the Trump administration. I think there were a lot of expectations with the Biden administration coming in, but I think there was also a little bit of hesitation in Europe. And I sit in Brussels most of the days in gray weather, like you do, Suzanne. And I think we felt that there was a need for the transatlantic relationship to resurface and show results to sort of build that confidence again. So I think one of the reasons why the project is important and why this report is important is we actually need to nurture that relationship. It's not necessarily there all the time at the same strength that we've seen in the past. So I actually think the next generation of leaders and also the answers that you put into the survey is a good reminder to all of us that we have to do our part to make that happen. Now, that's it. And I think the report actually shows, both when you look at the values that are most important for Europeans and we look at the ones that are most important for the Americans, and then you look at the ones that are sort of pointing to the future, the relationship is actually not perhaps in a better state than what we tend to discuss on a day-to-day basis. And I think when we look ahead, there seems to be consensus around both climate change, around security issues, about technology issues. But I do think, and similarly to what Adrian said, that we are in an important moment, and you're representing a big technology company. I'm not going to hide the fact that I think technology plays an incredibly important role in this, both in terms of sort of trust in our institutions, trust in technology. I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is, of course, also an indication that cybersecurity is no longer sort of a theoretical aspect. It's something that has a direct impact on the real world. So I think the bottom line is that whether we represent the private sector, civil society, media, or government or international institutions, we need to lean in and we need to invest in the transatlantic relationship. I'm a firm believer in it. I think we need it. I think the world needs it. But we need to do a little bit more to get it back on track.
Yeah, Casper, you just picked up something I was going to go to next, which was a big theme of our discussions. Beatrice, I will come to you afterwards, but just before I get to you, which was technology, the role of technology here, the responsibility of tech companies, the responsibility of governments. And, Adrian, I might bring you in on this, because I know you do a lot about the whole issue of disinformation as well. But one of the things we found in the report was that there was a difference. I mean, not to generalize too much, there were different perspectives between what America thinks and what Europe on things like privacy, on the right to privacy, on what is the appropriate level of regulation. And we've seen that over the last few years with a lot of tension between Washington and Brussels, even under the Obama era, where, you know, President Obama, for example, criticized the European Commission for taking too strong of a stance against what he saw at American tech companies. Now, things have changed, and that I think there's been a big change in America. There's been more of a bipartisan support for greater regulation of tech companies for different reasons, but there is. But Adrian, just maybe you come in on that, on the role of technology and disinformation, and how much of a threat that is for this issue.
Yes, certainly so. You're right that you know, Europe and the United States obviously have different views, particularly as it relates to regulation. You know, regulation of speech, as you mentioned, disinformation, but also regulation of privacy. I think it's just important to kind of take a step back and realize that whatever differences that Europe and the United States have, our differences with China or Russia or even India to a certain extent are far greater. And so I think that, you know, we can't get lost in some of the squabbles around, you know, the role of government in regulating technology companies, when I think it's very important just to realize that we need to be leading. The transatlantic relationship has this opportunity to set the standards around digital technology. And if Europe and the United States are not doing this, then China will essentially be leading that. So I think that perhaps there's sort of like a yin and yang approach where, you know, the US, I think, has been generally leading the way when it comes to technological innovation. And then on the European side, you know, when it comes to regulatory capacity, the ability to produce legislation like the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, I think that both the EU and the US have their strengths. And I think that what needs to happen is, instead of producing conflict, that we need to de-escalate that. I think that it's great to see things like the Technology Council, Technology and Trade Council coming up. And I am somewhat optimistic that there will be greater collaboration between democracies on this issue, because I think it's, you know, to be frank, it's needed, just given the real fundamental differences that we have with, you know, officials in the Chinese Communist Party who have very different views around the role of technology in governance.
Yeah, and that was one of the findings, Adrian, as you point out, the need. I think all participants, we were delving into these kind of differences of approaches, but the need for more alignment, that would help structure and cement the transatlantic reliance, the relationship, that needs to change and evolve to reflect the reality of our modern world with the role of technology and quite frankly, the negative role of technology in, you know, fomenting, you know, false narratives, theories of election fraud, etc. It's now the primary tool that's been used to cut across democracy. Casper, do you want to come in and anything on that? I mean, just, are the tech companies, is there more of a, do they see their role here, that this is now becoming a something that they need to step up to at this moment?
I think most companies do that today. I think I'll also be honest in saying perhaps not all companies to the degree that I think is necessary. But I think, you know, the majority of sort of mature companies are seeing the societal responsibility today does not only lie with public officials or with governments or international organizations. Because of the influence we have over, you know, a digital future, we have to make sure that we also, through the technology we develop and deploy, that we help protect democracy, that we protect fundamental rights, etc. I think Adrian is pointing to, of course, some of the concerns about the misuse of new technology, and a lot of that is, of course, related to the role of social media, you know, instigating fake news, disinformation, you know, stirring things up. I do want to, and it doesn't come naturally to a Dane to be optimistic. I do also want to sort of make a small plea in saying that I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact of the fantastic opportunities that technology can also provide. I mean, we're meeting today despite sitting in many different places. I think when we look back at the last couple of years with the global pandemic, had this happened 5, 6, 7 years ago, I think our economies, our jobs would have been in a much more dire situation than they are today. So I think, like with everything else in life, it's sort of a mixed bag where technology offers opportunities, but it can also be misused in the hands of the wrong people. But I do think, and I think that's the bottom line, that we are waking up to a reality where we cannot hide and not pretend that we have to be part of the solution. And I think, I had an experience many years ago with, not with the Aspen Institute, but with the German Marshall Fund, where I had the opportunity to travel to the US and spend 5 weeks traveling in different parts of the US. And I think building that understanding across the Atlantic, where there might be differences on some issues, privacy, national security are good examples, but where I fundamentally believe that the shared values keeps us much stronger together. And I think building those bridges and making sure that we have a common understanding, even on issues that we disagree with, is incredibly important. And the last point, Susanne, I'll promise to stop talking, is I think whether you work again in the private sector or in the public sector, we actually have a shared interest in making sure that the US and Europe is getting closer together, including on the regulatory agenda.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a big topic. We might come back to it slightly a bit later. Beatrice, I just wanted to bring you in here, given your expertise. The issue of sustainability was a big discussion point, and climate change, energy efficiency, sustainability were all priorities. We're all seen as a huge important part of the transatlantic relationship. I mean, what was your main takeaways from our discussions and from this report?
Thank you, Suzanne, and also to the Aspen Institute and Microsoft for making this possible. We are talking now about the collaboration between the public and the private sector. And maybe I can continue on this because both the American and the European colleagues in the workshops agreed that private investment, leadership and advocacy are necessary to address the climate emergency. However, we could notice some differences, and I think that's something expected since there's a cultural element here, and at general level, we have different ideas about the roles of the private sector and the public sector at both sides of the Atlantic. But I think maybe it's because of the generation factor here. We all have lived the 2008 financial crisis and the consequences. What our discussion replicated what we are seeing now, and it's what I like to call an Europeization of the USA, because we are seeing that with Biden administration, public investment is a big thing now with the American job plan, the infrastructure plan. So we are seeing a bigger role of the public sector in the rebuilding of the American economy after COVID-19. And on the other side, there's the Americanization of the UE, of the European Union, because we are seeing that governments are making a firm commitment to combating climate change, but this is going to require a huge investment, and we do know that the private sector will need to deliver a substantial percentage of the total cost. And I was checking some sources, and about the whole European Union, we're talking at least of 1 trillion euros. And from the public sector, we will need to mobilize 280 billion euros to make this possible. So the challenge is there. And here I think we can get inspired by this American spirit about, more room for the private initiative. And maybe just another issue that we discussed on this, and is that private companies have a role regardless of the public initiatives. And we discussed about the role of fossil fuel producers. We cannot forget that the 20 largest fossil fuel companies are responsible for the 35% of global emissions from the 60s to 2018. And last May, and I remember we discussed this in the workshops, we have what happened to Exxon and the coup that they have at the board. So 2 members were replaced, and it was to work towards a greener strategy of the company, and we're talking about Exxon. And the very same day, a Dutch court ordered Royal Dutch Shell to reduce the carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. So again, there's a lot that can be done just by the private companies.
Yes, Beatrice, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the themes about, where does responsibility lie for sustainability? And you're absolutely right. We discussed some, how things had changed. A lot of these American corporations, energy companies now taking that extremely seriously. I mean, one of the things I think we spoke about was, you mentioned before about how confident the EU is doing its Green Deal. And it's Fit for 55 package. And, we had COP late last year. And, there's a sense that if we stand back, Europe is a leader in climate change, at least compared to the other big polluters. But it's going to take a lot. Like, the proof now is in the pudding. There's all these plans. But now, as you say, there's a lot of money involved. I mean, do you think, are you hopeful about what's going to happen in Europe, or are you more hopeful, or do you welcome the fact the Biden administration, for example, is putting a lot of emphasis on climate?
I'm optimistic. And I think the transatlantic leadership is key here, because I think we can help each other. Whenever the European Union fails in commitments or in implementation, I think we can use the American example to give us a nudge, and vice versa. And we saw it in COP26 in Glasgow, for example, when Biden launched the pledge to reduce methane emissions. And again, I'm a practitioner. So as you know, I implement a European program dedicated to fight climate change. And I do work every day with the stakeholders, with the ones that get the European funds and implement the programs. And I mean, it's a real challenge, because one thing is to set the policies, and even this needs to be approved by the national parliament. And that's a challenge on one side, and on the other side, you need to implement and get the results. And here you need to engage citizens and nonprofits, etc. And I think there's a big margin to improve here, both in the US and European Union. And we saw it in France with the revolts in 2018. So we can do it, and we need both sides of the Atlantic to make sure that we get it on time.
Yeah, it's a good point, Beatrice, because one of the themes that we touched on is in the report, and maybe Adrian, you come in on this, it is the role of civil society. And, maybe that is also feeding into what Federica said at the beginning, which is about, she implied this, that this disconnect with the newer generation, and how are they going to engage with the transatlantic relationship. And we see, we do see distrust in institutions sometimes, but part of that is increasing the voice of civil society. Adrian, I mean, is that something you see as important for the promotion and the protection of democracy?
Yeah, I think it's fundamental. I really do think that it's up to each generation to build, support and the legitimacy and credibility of governing institutions, of civil society, and even, shaping the attitudes and the actions of corporations. I think that this is very much a generation that is open to that challenge, that is globally connected in a way that previous generations perhaps have not been. And that, I think, is helping to create this type of global civil society movement where groups that are based in Europe can easily share notes and coordinate with those based in the United States. But also that a lot of that sharing and information collection happens beyond just the transatlantic relationship, that we are so much more connected to developing countries, to those in the global South, understanding what are the issues that they're running up against, what are the ways that we that the actions of democracies are unintentionally creating problems, around the global South, especially technology. That's something where, when Casper mentioned the sort of negative impact of social media, that's something, and disinformation, we had been tracking this for over a decade, just because we knew how much it was having a negative effect on the politics of different countries around the world. And so when it showed up in 2016 in the United States, it didn't come as a surprise. And to be frank, I think that we just collectively need to be more perceptive around the impact of technology on politics and human rights around the world, because many of these same issues are then coming back to roost within our democracies. And so it's very important that the EU and the United States have programs where they are providing support and also communicating with their partners around the world, because many of these issues are global problems. They will require global solutions. Climate change is obviously one of the big ones, but I think also on technology, it's important that when the United States and the EU are moving forward in creating a framework for shared values and regulatory coordination, that they bring other democracies together with them, and also countries that are not yet democratic, because the real power of the internet is its global nature, that wherever you are, whether you're in Saudi Arabia or Eswatini, you can connect to this global network and have access to the same resources and opportunities that come if you were based out of Savannah, Georgia. So it's fundamental that we remember that, even if we have the rise of authoritarian powers, that democracy, openness, these are universal values that are highly regarded by people all around the world, and that the systems that we create need to be open, and we should not be, sort of walling ourselves off out of fears of, that China or other authoritarian powers might interfere in our own systems.
Yeah, so embrace the positives in a sense, even though that some of these principles are so under threat. Yeah. We're just going to bring in a couple of questions here, and we're going to hear from two of our NextGen members, Zach and Savannah, I believe, if they're on the line, as it were.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's Savannah, yeah.
Yes, great. Well, it's wonderful to see you all. What an impressive conversation. Not surprised hearing these conversations over the summer with our wonderful cohort. It was really an honor to be able to join you all. Really quickly, I want to just ask the panel something that we discussed more in the lens of non-security threats and non-traditional security elements, and something that I think is really relevant in this conversation. As the security threats in the transatlantic communities continue to grow, we see continued economic insecurity. Within this transatlantic initiative, we see global economic shocks throughout the world following the impact of COVID-19. We see the global she-cession, as they're calling it. So my question to the panelists would be, what role should the transatlantic relationship have in building economic opportunity, particularly for women and girls? And what role can transatlantic partners realistically put into place?
Okay, thanks very much, Savannah. Any one of our panelists want to come in there? I mean, maybe Casper, I'll come to you, but just first of all, I mean, I was involved with this conversation about economic opportunity and during our workshops. And I think Savannah's making a good point. Now, in our recommendations, I think we did find that participants didn't necessarily see this as one of the biggest elements, but it's arguably the biggest relationship, I mean, between Europe and America is an economic one. The trade, I don't have the figures now, but it's one of the biggest trading partnerships in the world, if not the biggest, I think, between the EU and America. And how that can help people. I mean, Adrian, you touched on it there, I think, by talking about the positives of technology, how they can open up the world and they can increase opportunities. Casper, anything on that? I mean, do you think it's important to keep that in mind for policymakers, for corporations, that people don't feel left behind, particularly maybe women and girls, in terms of economic opportunity?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a great question from Savannah. Thanks a lot for posing it. Let me say a couple of positive things, and I'll turn to the question, because I think, Savannah, you're pointing to one of the areas where we're not where we need to be. I think the positive thing, if we begin with the transatlantic relationship, is that perhaps it is on the two issues that you identify in your report looking forward, so climate change and the role around technology. I think you could say that it has historically not been as closely together as it is currently. I think, we saw with Secretary Kerry visiting Brussels, a lot of interest in how the EU and the US can work together around the sustainability agenda, carbon adjustment mechanisms, discussing basically how you can bring down, carbon emissions to promote, sustainability more broadly. I think the same you could argue around the technology agenda, where we have seen the establishment of the Trade and Technology Council, a number of working groups. We have seen the first meeting in Pittsburgh that I think was extremely well received on both sides of the Atlantic. And I would say, generally speaking, I think there is a convergence on the regulatory agenda between DC and Brussels. Does that mean that both sides agree on everything? No, they don't. But I do think there is an interest, and actually,
I think we may have lost Casper there. Anyone else want to come in? I mean, maybe Beatrice, just on the issue of the women and girls opportunity. I mean, is there a role here on the sustainability side of things on this?
Yeah, I mean, when I was listening to Savannah and Casper, I mean, when we are talking about climate change, we are talking about economy. I think it's something that we cannot separate. And one of the things that we discussed, and it's in the report, it's about just transition. And it's so fighting climate change, it's about creating jobs in the new technologies and that are going to be used to transform our economies. And here the element you mentioned, girls, women, but also like workers in fossil fuel sectors that are going to lose their jobs. We need to find a place for them. So I think climate change is giving an opportunity to fix old issues, like what's the role of women in technological sectors, for example, but also an opportunity to make sure that no one is left behind, which is something that needs to be considered by our governments, because if not, public opinion will not support the measures that will be taken to implement the Green Deal at both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point. Just maybe briefly, Adrian, on that, like, I suppose what Beatrice you're explaining in a way is the Trump effect. The idea, if you leave people behind economically, there are going to be political implications to that. And that is a big debate happening here in Europe, also in America, about the just transition, as you say, about who's going to be most affected, how do we help them out of it. Countries like Poland, I mean, Poland is an example of it's a bit of a problem child at the moment for the European Union, because it is breaching rule of law standards. It's in constant conflict with Brussels. It's also the country that's going to be probably most affected by this climate transition, because it's so dependent on coal. So, in terms of participation, I mean, Adrian, anything there on how voters can get disillusioned, and, the importance of keeping them engaged?
Certainly, yeah. I really appreciate Savannah's question and Beatrice's point there about those left behind. And I think, as Beatrice mentioned, this is the generation which came through the 2008 economic crisis, oftentimes, getting out of university or trying to find jobs. And I think so one thing that is perhaps more important is around economic inequality and inclusion. And I think that right now, given the high levels of inequality, especially in the United States, there is this the need to make sure that the prosperity that is generated from our economic system is more inclusive. Otherwise, as you mentioned, we will see the rise of politics of resentment and nativism, which oftentimes has economic causes to it. So I very much take that point, and I would just make another one, which is when it comes to particularly around issues of technology, I think many of the negative externalities that have come from the current phase of technology, particularly as it relates to social media, stem from a lack of diversity among within Silicon Valley. I think that for the most part, it was the people that were making products and key decisions were very heterogeneous or very homogenous. And I think that there very much is the need for greater diversity within STEM, particularly within tech companies, to make sure that many of the products that they are building have human rights in mind, that they have the ways that these can be abused by people or to target women and girls or members of the LGBTQ community. I mean, these were questions that were totally absent in many of the first generation of these technologies. Thankfully, now I think that they have been incorporated more and more, and it's been great to see that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Zach, I'm going to come to you in a second, but Casper, anything to add on that? I mean, this is a very good point about the lack of diversity in Silicon Valley. I mean, what would you say to that?
Yeah, and I hope you appreciate it. I just wanted to make sure you can also see that even when you work for a big technology company, you can have a breakdown in connectivity. So sorry about that. No, I think the point and what I was trying to say is that when you look back at the last couple of years, also during COVID-19, the degree of digitalization in societies and communities have really made a difference, either in a positive way or in a negative way. But it is not only about geography, about whether you live in Southern Europe or Northern Europe or in a particular state in the US. What we know also from our data set is that women has been proportionally harder hit also by COVID, more job losses, etc. So I think there are many, many reasons why we need to focus a lot more on gender and these issues, and why our recovery and resilient packages, whether it's in the US or in Europe, needs to have a very, very clear focus on making sure that it's inclusive and it has full focus on the challenges. And then, let me just be super honest. I think we have a significant problem also in the tech industry. We need a better gender equality. We need to focus a lot more on diversity and inclusion. I think that's something we're doing. It's not happening as fast as we want it to, but I think it's a really good point that Savannah is pointing out. Part of our common value framework across the Atlantic is equal opportunity, is sort of the fundamental human rights that I think we all adhere to, and that also makes it necessary for us to make progress on the gender side. And then if you allow me, Susanna, just on the sustainability side, I think it's such a fundamental question. I mean, these days we're very focused towards what's happening towards the east here in Europe, but I think we have this looming climate crisis that are going to have such a big impact. And I think the panel really highlighted that in their survey and in their discussions, that we need to do more. And I think this is where companies will increasingly, if they're not already coming under scrutiny, we will be held to account for what we do. We have set ourselves a very ambitious agenda in Microsoft around sustainability, becoming carbon negative and by 2030, and also reducing all our legacy emissions by 2050. But I actually think what we're increasingly finding out is that our biggest contribution to fighting climate change and sustainability is actually for us to develop state-of-the-art technology tools, plug-and-play tools that will make it possible for smaller companies to also set very ambitious targets, and for them to be able to measure and set the specific goals for themselves. So in other words, providing technology that will make it easier for everybody to contribute and to make a contribution to what I think is going to be the biggest crisis and biggest challenge for all of us.
Okay, thanks very much, Casper. Zach Kabowski, would you like to come to the floor now with your question?
Thanks, Suzanne, and I'm so glad to be joining this event this morning and to discuss all those important issues, but also to celebrate the results of the NextGen Transatlantic initiative. I mean, my question is in no surprise about the situation in Ukraine. Is the transatlantic community prepared to respond to a possible violent aggression of Russia in Ukraine? And what about the technological concerns and cyber threats that this challenge could raise?
Yeah, anyone want to come in on that in our panelists, the whole situation in Ukraine? Adrian?
Yeah, sure. To start us off on this, thank you, Zach, for the question. This is certainly top of mind for Freedom House and so many, and obviously those in Ukraine right now. I really do think that this is one place where we need to make sure that we're not blaming the transatlantic relationship for other issues. And I think that when it comes to security, obviously the bonds of NATO continue to be very strong. But I read an op-ed in a Brussels-based media outlet relatively recently that was saying this was all about the fall of the transatlantic relationship, but then was not mentioning anything that the European Union was doing on the issue of Ukraine and Russia. So I do think that there is this challenging issue, whether it's Russia or China, that there are still differing views within, particularly within the European Union, on how the EU can be united on this issue. And I think that that's part of the difficulties around Ukraine, is that whether it's the Trump administration or the Biden administration, is ensuring that there is unity when it comes to some of the economic issues or the security issues that are in place when it comes to, on Russia and Ukraine. And I think that, getting back to that previous question, that there has to be a sort of cold reckoning on whether we are privileging the economic relationship that we have with some of these authoritarian powers, or are we going to stand up for democracy and human rights, particularly when it's something like the invasion of a sovereign country, which is within Europe's own neighborhood.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. I mean, look, this would be a topic for a long time, but I think that issue of the unity or lack of in Europe, and then, where does power or should power or response lie? I mean, NATO or the EU and the tension around that. And then just to maybe link into what we're saying about the economic relationship. I mean, this is where the EU has clout when it comes to sanctions, maybe not militarily, maybe not other way, but it is interesting that a lot of the debate here is I'm covering it here as a journalist constantly. It's hugely sensitive. It's secret. They're trying to, coordinate with the Americans on this, but, building up a possible sanction list, how that impacts different countries and their own sensitivities is a highly complex maneuver, and it's one of the areas of discussion here at the moment. We're nearly coming to the end, so I just want to do a tiny quick, like 1 minute whip around to our three panelists for some final thoughts, but just to pick up on some of the questions we're seeing. I like this one. Somebody was saying, Andre Lissekrug, I think, that we often hear how complementary US and EU can be, and US on tech and EU on regulation. But how effective is EU regulation really? For example, did the GDPR actually not strengthen big tech? Is the EU delusional about its true influence? So that's a good point. I mean, maybe I made a few sweeping comments there about the EU thinks this, America is doing that, but actually, how good is it in terms of regulation? As we know, a lot of these proposals are very much watered down when it gets through the Parliament and the Council. We're seeing that now with the immediate, in the DMA and the DSA, the big tech regulations at the moment. We're only at the start of that, really. So let's see what the finished product is. Okay, just finally, quick turnaround. Beatrice, maybe some final thoughts about what you took from both this discussion and more generally on our NextGen report.
I promise 1 minute. I will be very brief. But to end and to link to what was just said, I think there's a very strong link between the fight against climate change and security too. And we shouldn't forget this. Even NATO has climate change in its agenda. And it's not about just global immigration, for example, but let's talk about the Western Balkans, not just Eastern Europe. I mean, the Western Balkans have been knocking to the European Union door for a long time, and China is investing a lot, and we could do that also with the urgency of fighting or adapting or mitigating climate change. So my last comment will be that the NextGen thinks that the climate crisis is a crisis in leadership, both at global and local level. So here the transatlantic bond has a huge role to play. And I think everyone from every corner of the world should be looking at us and expect us to lead this transformation.
Great, thank you very much for that, Beatrice. Casper, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. I think just a quick comment on the security element of it, because I think to some extent, Suzanne, you said it correctly. This is not only a national security issue when we look about cybersecurity. The digital economy is heavily impacted by cyber attacks. We're seeing an increasing trend on that. So also for that sake, we need to make sure that we are focusing more on mitigating the threats that are not going to disappear, unfortunately, in the next couple of years. And then I don't know if it's very clever of me to do this, but I think it's a fantastic report. I think the panel are pointing to some really interesting areas, by the way, including the necessity to regulate artificial intelligence. I think that's spot on. There's one area where I disagree and where I actually wanted to provide sort of a little bit of a pitch, and that is the focus on bilateral issues rather than multilateral issues. You know, I come from a diplomacy background, so I just wanted to say I think it is important also for the next generation of leaders that we don't underestimate the importance of multilateralism. I think we need strong international organizations to deal with trade issues, to deal with security issues, to deal with regulatory issues, whether it's the European Union, whether it's NATO, whether it's the United Nations. So I think if I can leave, the panelists and the members with one thought, don't underestimate the necessity of focusing on multilateralism. Thanks again.
In a report, more of an emphasis on bilateralism rather than multilateralism. Finally, over to you, Adrian.
Yeah, just real quick to plus one everything that Beatrice and Casper have mentioned, and I think to say how important it is to be in discussion, across the transatlantic relationship, and I think that's where the NextGen network is, and things like the NextGen network are crucial to meeting a lot of the challenges that we've brought up here, where very much we do need more dialogue. We need more collaboration. This will be vital, I think, to making sure that not only the transatlantic relationship is strong, but also that we're defending the values around technology, climate change, and democracy around the world.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much to all our panelists, to Federico and Margarini earlier on. And please check out our report. The link is in our Q&A box at the side. Thank you very much to Microsoft. Thank you very much to our panelists. And thank you very much to the audience. Delighted to chair this really stimulating conversation. So thank you very much for all your participation.